Okay, well, why don't we dive in? I know we've got a short 30 minutes together, so want to make the most of your time. So first off, welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ned Calder, and I work for a firm called Innosight. We're focused on helping organizations address disruptive change. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Rob Bell and Freddie Solis, who lead our work in the industrial and technology sectors. A couple quick just notes on housekeeping items before we dive into the context. Can advance to the next slide. The webinar is going to be recorded. We're going to use that to take some clips and notes from the conversations. We have all the participants muted, but our aspiration is to, as much as possible, make this interactive. So we've got both the Q&A function and the chat function enabled. Would love to take any and all questions as we go through the session. We'll keep an eye on them and try to address them as they come up. And lastly, we're going to share some materials today. We will make those materials available after the session. We've also got some articles that are linked to what we'll be talking about. Those are certainly available folks as well who are looking to go a little bit deeper. Okay, with that in mind, why don't we dive right in? So we've got 30 minutes together, and our goal over that time period is to talk about a fairly significant reset in terms of how companies collaborate with one another. Rob, Freddie, and I, and Innosight more broadly, spend a lot of time working with organizations on big breakthrough opportunities. How do you derive disruptive change into markets? And when we're working on these challenges, one of the issues that we run into, quite a bit, it relates to the nature of collaboration, within those, environments. Often those challenges are systemic in nature. So to drive truly disruptive change requires changing multiple parts of the ecosystem, and that's challenging for any individual, company to do. If we consider, for example, something like disruption happening in the automotive industry. Sure, OEMs play a really critical role in setting the pace of change, but they can't do everything on their own. They depend critically on suppliers to innovate components, as well as to contribute things like charging solutions and new, battery value chains. And in the context of those types of challenges, this issue of the relationship between players is a really challenging one, often because those relationships are characterized by fairly transactional, issues. They get, mired in a focus on, current contracts and volumes and pricing, and really under, really transactional issues that prevent them from, thinking longer term, thinking more openly about really strategic issues and how they could work together on different types of problems to drive, change into the market. So our goal here is to dive into that problem and how we can make progress, against it. We've got three very specific, topics that we're going to try to get to. One is we want to introduce a language to think about different types of relationships. So we want to be able to characterize different types of relationships and talk about the shift that we're suggesting. We're going to bring that shift to life through some examples of work that we've done in the industrial success sector. And then lastly, we want to share and provide a very brief overview of some of the best practices required to reset relationships and try to move them from more transactional to a much more strategic orientation. So that's what we're on about, and I think we're going to dive right in. And Rob, I think you want to tee up kind of a way to think about this problem.
Great, thanks, Ned. Yeah, I'd like to share with you how we frame the opportunity space in conversations, with our clients, and ultimately this is a question of how, as a supplier, and by the way, we're coming into this right now with a supplier mindset, but we should keep in our minds today as we have this conversation and continue to think about this approach. There's benefits to both parties. That's an essential element of the concept, and so there's a way to think about this as the buyer as well. But there's a question of self-definition, and if we look across the top line on the chart that we're looking at here, the vast majority of buyer-seller relationships are in the category that we would characterize as transactional, and within those relationships, as a supplier, you define yourself by the products that you sell. Now, around that, we can imagine relationships that have broader opportunities to affect, total value creation. So you could imagine going beyond that to a relationship that we would characterize as consultative in nature, where we define ourselves by the problems that we help our partner to solve. Or then beyond that, we could imagine a relationship that moves out to a strategic lens where we define ourselves by the impact that we have. Now, the challenge is if you have existed for time immemorial in this transactional silo, it's often quite challenging to break out of it. And so the question that we addressed is, how do you think about evolving your way out of, and how do you create a situation that enables you to begin evolving your way out of that transactional silo and into a place where broader value creation is available to you? So the way to think about that then is by thinking about what is the customer's process, what is their thought process with respect to taking advantage of any specific strategic opportunity. Well, it starts on the left with setting the strategy and agenda, moves into questions of identifying how to execute against that and what solutions they might leverage to perform that execution. And only at that point, then, do they get to the questions that might be the ones that you as a supplier see on a day-to-day basis. What are the specifications of the product that we need to buy, and how much can we afford to pay for it? And maybe, what are the characteristics that we need in terms of the convenience with which we access it or how it's delivered to us, the basic logistics of taking delivery on that product. Then beyond that, as things are implemented, the question becomes, all right, how do I successfully implement and operationalize, and how do I continuously manage and improve? So we've moved from left to right across the page. And in most organizations, there is a boundary set around that transactional that's been erected for convenience and for defensive purposes in terms of price discipline, et cetera, and procurement manages that central piece. And you are managed by procurement within that central piece. Now, any good sales representative or sales team, of course, is working outside that space continuously to try to gather intelligence and try to have influence. But there's typically a pretty strong defensive reaction that's making it difficult for you to do that. So what do you have to do to change the conditions to enable you to participate differently and engage differently with the client? One thing more that I'll mention as we look at this broad framework is that it is often the case that you earn your way into those outer boundaries by beginning to perform more to the right. So as a supplier, how do I think about adding value in terms of successful implementation around solutions and operational capabilities? How do I bring more to the table there? That can then invite me to the party in terms of discussions around execution gaps and solution options. Once established there, how do I move again to the right and begin to think about how to derive the most value from this that then earns my way into the conversation that starts all the way over on the left. I'm going to pause there. This is at one level super simple and a little bit obvious. At another level, there's some pretty interesting subtleties to it. If anyone's got any questions they want to throw out, feel free to pipe up or throw them in the chat. But what I'd like to do is illustrate this with a client example.
Yes, we certainly invite folks to throw questions in the chat. So I love your point that there's a lot of subtlety to this framework, Rob. And one of the ones that stands out to me the most, the more we do this with our clients, is just the mindset reframe that is required to do this well. It's just helping teams shift out of conversations of products that we're selling, contracts that are going to be renegotiated, in the next year, to what is the strategy of our customer? What is the impact that we can have on that strategy, and what are the bigger problems that they need to solve? And that it's much more than tactics and frameworks. It's a little bit of a mindset shift in and of itself. I think we've got a question in the Q&A from Ruben that says, I assume this corresponds fully and is gaining more importance with ever-growing trend of servitization, right? So I think a little bit of the question around, like, you know, as folks offer services and solutions more and more, this type of framework and approach becomes more and more important. So Ned, Rob, invite you to chime into that.
Yeah, there's a clear relationship there. I mean, I think assuming that we're interpreting that correctly, a lot of challenges arise around the ability of your customer to actually realize the full value of some of the innovation that you're putting forward. And that drives you into more of an innovation space where you might be wrapping software and solutions around a product, for example. And as soon as you do that, you know, you're stretching the boundaries of that transactional relationship, and you're getting involved in things like business model innovation and how do we monetize the value of this, and it necessitates that you break out of that transactional mode and begin to have conversations that are in the other bands. Okay. And then the question, yeah, go ahead, Fred.
No, go ahead. So I was just going to say, I see a couple of other questions that I think you're going to hit, you know, as we get into the story. So why don't we hold those 2-3 questions that have come in, and, you know, as we advance, we'll come back to them.
That's perfect. Yeah, let us tell a story that I think will begin to, you know, to shed a little bit of light on that. And you know, the key here is, as suggested, I think, by some of those questions, you know, the need to create a catalyst that opens up that conversation, and to be able to, you know, to come to your client with a story that is sufficiently compelling that they're willing to begin stretching the boundaries of who you have access to and what kinds of conversations you can have with them. So I'm going to tell a story about a client of ours. They are a division of a large global chemical company. They sell raw materials that go into a product that is so ubiquitous that I can virtually guarantee you that it is within your line of sight right now. I'm not going to say what it is, but you can puzzle over that one for the remainder of our time on the call. But the situation for them, however, was that they were very much in a transactional relationship with many of their largest clients. Their industry was in a consolidation mode, so the percentage of their sales going through those, you know, half a dozen large clients down the value chain was increasing. There was increasing price pressure on them due to that consolidation and some slowing around typical dimensions of innovation in the industry. Their clients were even beginning to backward integrate and perform some of the functions that they had traditionally performed. But at the same time, you know, our client themselves are a significant, thought of corporately as significant, sophisticated global player in the chemicals industry with a lot of latent capabilities that one could imagine could provide value to their customer if the channels were only open to begin to consider how those might work. So, you know, incredible strength in terms of their own supply chain, their presence across a wide variety of global markets that might look like growth opportunities for their customers, their ability to manage sophisticated data and analyses around the use of their products, and their, you know, mastery of some of the operational complexities around the use of their products were just a handful of the kind of latent capabilities that they had that were not being accessed by their customers. And so, the conversation that we entered into them about was, how can we think creatively about the ways that we could create mutual value by leveraging the capabilities that you have and better understanding the needs that they have. And that thought process and that sort of catalytic question, kicked off a process that was ultimately a very disciplined process and resulted in a real change in the relationship. And I think we can probably use the next page to tell that story. But Freddie and Ned, I want to make sure that I haven't missed any of the major points on the setup.
No, I think you got him.
All right. Great. So we embarked with them on a process with 5 major steps to it. And the first one was to step out of their mindset as a product provider for the client and begin instead to put themselves in the shoes of the customer and think about what the customer needs to do in terms of jobs to be done. Now that's an insight term of art, which I think has actually been pretty broadly propagated. So most people, know the definition, but it's the progress that a customer wants to make in a defined set of circumstances. So it's not typically defined as product features and benefits, but it's what is the customer trying to do when they buy your product? What are they trying to do? And what are they trying to do around that? And what are they trying to do more broadly? So you can think about this at multiple levels. You can think about jobs to be done at a strategic level as well as at a technical product performance level. And looking at the client that way would reveal things like, they are really keenly interested in managing down the operational complexity that is driving a lot of their costs right now. Or they are extremely concerned about the reliability of the supply chain in extraordinary circumstances, because it's really important for them to maintain their own capacity utilization and their ability to deliver to the market so that it gets supplanted by competitors. Or their customers are looking for more sustainable products. So how effectively are they able to innovate on those products? So all of these questions taken from the customer side then become an opportunity for you to imagine ways that you could work together to deliver against those jobs. And those would, of course, go far outside the scope of the materials that they deliver to put into it. Secondly, you then do an assessment of those. So we've got dozens of hypotheses about these. Let's line them up. Let's analyze them. Let's figure out what's most important to them. Let's figure out what has the highest potential value. And let's figure out, and for both parties, let's validate the idea that these are things that could be valuable for both. And of course, the sources of information here are, publicly available, all the intelligence you can glean from the contacts that you already have inside the client organization, and then just sharp analytics around jobs to be done, around scale, scope, etc., to just get a general sense of what these are. And what you're working on here in these first 2 stages is really to create a case for action for the client. Something that you can bring to a key executive in the customer organization that's going to open their eyes to the possibility of a broader, more collaborative, more strategic relationship with you and get the conversation moving. What's really critical at that point then is, who do you talk to? And here, of course, the most important thing is we're not going to talk to just our procurement representative. You have to find a way to get outside of it. In the case of our friends at Chemco, and Freddie's going to show you a display in a minute here. That map of opportunity spaces was sufficiently compelling internally at Chemco that they were comfortable elevating it up and creating a top-to-top conversation built around that. And so the next part of the effort was really aligning internally at Chemco how to get that top-to-top organized, and then bringing the ask to the customer. Okay, our CEO, was going to come to you anyway because there's a ceremonial meeting that happens once every year because we're big clients of each other's. But now we're going to convert that meeting. We're going to convert it into a different kind of a conversation with purpose. And the purpose is going to be, we're going to share these ideas and we're going to try to secure agreement that what happens next is that our conversation turns into a process. And that process is managed by people on both sides who live outside of that procurement governed relationship. And that process then moves into mutual discovery and development of opportunities that ultimately then can turn into a defined, joint collaboration process on them. So where Chemco is right now is that they are in stage 4. So that top-to-top conversation was effective. It broke things open. There's a steering committee developed, of which procurement is a part of that steering committee, but procurement doesn't own that steering committee. So it has permission to extend the conversation into operations, into supply chain, into strategic growth, into innovation around sustainable materials, which were places where they were having trouble getting the conversation going. So I think that's the point. I don't think that this is, we often say it's not rocket science, but it is real work. And what it requires is that perspective of jobs to be done, that creation of a map of mutual opportunities, and then the boldness on the part of the company to elevate that and create that catalytic moment. And then finally, the idea that when you get that moment, it's not just ephemeral. Oh, sure, that sounds great. Let's go do that. Because if you walk away from the table and that's all you've got, the next day, everyone will be back at their desk doing the same jobs they were doing before. What you need is a clear agreement and alignment that we're not just going back to our desks and doing the same jobs we did before. We're doing something different now, and we have a process by which we're going to advance that. So that's the story I think that we wanted to share, and I invite again Ned and Freddie to elaborate on that, and love to take some questions.
I think we're getting a question on like how to align incentives that often encourage employees to reach short-term milestones while building long-term relationships. I'm happy to take a first stab at that one.
Yeah, sure.
That is absolutely something that we've experienced with our clients as we've helped them through this. Separate story, but very, very similar circumstance. When we're helping a client navigate, the long-term relationships with their customer, one of the key issues is being able to, as I mentioned, like reframe the mindset of your internal team. That's one of the most important pieces of like forgetting about the day-to-day, even for a session, like forgetting about the day-to-day state of the relationship, like the contract that we're renegotiating, or if they're below on targets, for this particular, client that we're helping with, one of the key things is like we made the account executives and the key account owners of our client, part of the steering committee of this project and engagement. And so they were incentivized to both think longer term, because that longer term emphasis would actually help them in the near term. If the relationship improved, at the highest levels of the organization, some of these near-term things would ease up as well. And so that's one of the things that helped in this particular circumstance, is making sure that the key account owners are part of the discussion and the conversation, and they understand what the value is that is going to be generated of this process. And yes, the day-to-day issues are not going to go away for a client. Like they were still dealing with contract negotiations and contract renewal, but at least there was enough energy and engagement in in the first two elements of this process, because those folks that are on the front lines are the ones that usually have the insights on the customer jobs to be done and the ways to open up the value. I don't know, Ned and Rob, if you'd add anything to that.
Well, yeah, I would say that one of the chief complications of trying to do this is that your own internal team is going to be risk averse, right? It's a natural reaction for a person in a sales position like that to be saying, wait a second, you guys are going to come in here like a bull in a china shop, and you're going to get in the way of us just doing the blocking and tackling that we need so that I can get, so that we can get the sales that I promised and I can earn my bonus and all of that good stuff. But one of the things, so that separation, that pragmatic separation of the agendas is important, but also there's a carrot here, which is that if this is successful, this becomes a more strategic relationship. The amount of responsibility vested in the people running this relationship expands tremendously, becomes a different job. So there's a career progression available to, a person who is a relationship manager who's got the vision, to play ball with a strategy like this.
There's a couple of other questions that I'll one is, what are the challenges you've had to convince? What are the challenges you have had to face to change the mindset at a management level? So basically, how do you elevate a little bit of the messaging up? And maybe a related one is, would there be some differences for SMEs, like on deciding on where to focus, how to focus? It's challenging to get to the top of a multinational customer.
Changing the mindset is an interesting one. I think part of this, I think the first barrier you had to get over was, we've tried this, right? We've already tried this. But I think what broke through that in this case was that doing that jobs research up front and doing that framing work, actually convinced people that it wasn't something that they had done before, and it also convinced them that it was worth doing, that the value in play was really substantive. And in this case would have been, will be game changing, for Chemco, in terms of the total value that could be unlocked by succeeding here.
See, we're almost out of time.
Yeah.
We probably have time for one last question, if there's any. There was a question on whether we have an article with or a link. And we do have an article that goes into a lot more detail on the process and a couple of frameworks that we didn't get a chance to cover here. So, for example, how do you map broader areas of opportunity, or how we define those that we didn't get a chance to discuss in this conversation. But we do have an article that goes into a lot more depth into these concepts and these topics, and describes some examples into a little bit more detail.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. Well, if not, okay. We got a final question. In my experience, the existing culture is strong. It's so strong as smothering innovation, starting the customer value business model. Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. And that's a little bit of why Rob emphasized so much. Like, you've got to start with, like, what are the problems or the impact that you want to have, and then backtrack to, like, well, what are the blockers and barriers, and who do we need to go relationship wise to unlock that? I think that's maybe the thought we'd leave you with.
Yeah, I think this is a great call out about doing it adjacent rather than directly through existing relationships. And I think in this case we were working on both channels, and you certainly have less resistance when you go adjacent, and you can start in places that are less risky. But in this case, the prize was sufficiently compelling, that the organization was willing to drive this. And as I said, to drive it all the way up through, top to top, CEO to CEO conversation in multi-billion-dollar organizations.
Absolutely. Well, maybe I know we're a couple minutes over time, so we want to maybe pause here and thank you all for joining. We're always, you have our contact info on the screen. We've got the article link on the chat, and we always welcome a conversation on this topic. This is a topic that we're super passionate about, particularly as some of the problems that your organizations are facing are just getting more complex and multi-stakeholder. So this is an area that we're investing a ton of time thinking about. Excellent. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.